Thank you very much, Walter, and thanks everyone for attending this talk. I want to begin by asking some basic questions. Do you accept evolutionary theory? Only a minority of American adults do. Many more Europeans and Canadians and Japanese accept evolution. Do you think that evolutionary theory applies to our species as well as to animals? Many people act as though evolution has no relevance to our species. This is Charles Darwin, of course, who provided compelling evidence for natural selection, which explains the slow process of evolution quite compellingly. Do you think that evolution applies to our nervous system, that is, to behavior? Do you think it operates, to the contrary, only from the neck down? Some people seem to think that natural selection shaped our bodies, but not our brains. Many people seem to think that evolution applies to animal behavior, but not to human behavior. They think culture and language somehow exempt human behavior from natural selection. Do you think that when humans evolved language, their nervous system genes stopped working? Do you think that genes may influence infants' behavior, but once they develop language, genetic influences are swamped? Do you think that the human brain becomes immune to the genes that shaped its development? Do you believe that a species-wide anatomical or physiological trait, such as the tongue, the spleen, or fever, probably has some particular function or functions? Do you think the same reasoning applies to species-wide universal human behaviors, such as sleep, fear of heights, and speech? Do you ever wonder why certain behavioral universals exist, such as marriage, good depth perception, color vision, and disgust? We have many such behavioral universals, even though we often focus on individual and cultural differences in behavior. Maybe we take universals for granted precisely because they are ubiquitous. Many universal behaviors are emotions. I would like to give some examples of the possible function of particular emotions and discuss why emotions are fundamental to human behavior. Now, functional explanations are different from mechanistic explanations. For example, we are interested in the function of sleep, but that's a different question from what triggers somebody to fall asleep or to awaken. I encourage you to ask questions. If you put them in the chat, I'll try to get to them at some point, but we should have plenty of time for questions. Our behavior tends to be adaptive, just as our anatomical and physiological traits are. Most of our species-wide behaviors are adaptive or were adaptive in prehistory when our genetic program was shaped. Because of the slow rate of evolution, some of our traits are obsolete, ill-suited to modern society. But most universal traits are likely still to be adaptive, like our bodily traits. These include our reflexes, sensory and perceptual abilities, language, and capacity for learning. Universal means present in all cultures, but not necessarily in all individuals. For example, many universals apply only to infants or to just one gender. This reasoning about the adaptive value of universals also applies to our species' basic emotions, such as hunger, fear, fatigue, sex, and curiosity. Are you curious about why each of our emotions evolved? What function it serves for the individual? Natural selection favors traits that help the individual, but not necessarily the group. Individuals of a species differ genetically. Natural selection favors the most successful individuals. Species are not like teams that compete with each other. Most of the competition occurs among members of a species. For example, the fastest cheetah may catch the most prey. So we have to ask, how does the trait enhance the individual's biological fitness? What is an emotion? An emotion has several features. These include a specific affect, a feeling of pleasure or displeasure, that directs us to act in a particular adaptive way. Each affect is triggered by particular internal and external stimuli or elicitors. The affect may also evoke the nonverbal expression or physiological changes. Each feature of a given emotion, its elicitors, behavioral tendency, expressions, and physiological adjustments, makes adaptive sense. Many psychologists agree with this definition or something close to it, but there's little agreement on what the basic emotions are. Some psychologists even think that emotions are merely mental constructs with no grounding in specific brain structures. This casts doubt on whether animals and infants can experience emotions, since they lack higher cognitive capacities for determining what to feel. But in my view, every species-wide combination of elicitor, affect, and behavior constitutes a separately evolved emotion. We have about 20 affects. The most distinctive feature of an emotion is probably its affect. Evolutionary psychology has learned a lot about how the various emotions may function. These proposed explanations may have many exceptions, but they are generally valid, even if they need to be modified by more detailed analysis. The explanations are based on research on animals, the brain, physiology, and people around the world. Evolutionary psychologists generally agree on these functional explanations, but other psychologists have different views or more commonly may not ask functional questions. Some explanations may be trivially obvious, but may still warrant explicit recognition. I think the important thing is to seek to understand the function of each emotion, just as we seek to understand how other human structures and processes work, such as each hormone. We need to identify all the emotions because each addresses a different adaptive need. Fulfilling one cannot substitute for fulfilling another. If we know what all the emotions are, we can better determine which ones are operating in a given situation. We have to know what all the possibilities are. Here are some examples of possible functional explanations for particular emotions. I emphasize that these are somewhat speculative. It's hard to prove a functional explanation. Functional explanations are tested mainly by seeing if the trait occurs precisely in those organisms that would stand to benefit from it. For example, pregnancy nausea occurs in all mammals, not just women, so that they reject foods that likely to contain toxins or mutagens that might harm the fetus. So let's start with anger. The function of anger may not be obvious. What do you think it might be? Research indicates that we get angry when someone intentionally misbehaves, violates a social norm. Anger inclines us to attack the wrongdoer, usually verbally. This moralistic aggression functions ideally to punish and deter such misdeeds. The malefactor suffers some penalty, thus restoring fairness. Without a capacity for anger, people might be repeatedly mistreated. Without a capacity for anger, we might suffer all sorts of injustices. So anger can be a force for social change. We may even get angry when we ourselves are not victimized, but merely observe someone being mistreated. Of course, anger can result in misunderstanding or from misunderstanding and can lead to counter-aggression. But research suggests that expressing one's anger in a thoughtful, considerate way usually improves a personal relationship. Anger raises our heart rate and induces other bodily changes to prepare us for a possible fight. Anger has a distinct species-wide expression. This warns the offender and may elicit an apology that avoids an aggressive encounter. Awareness of one's misdeed usually results in guilt, another misunderstood adaptive emotion. Why do you think we feel guilt? Guilt, signaled by slumped posture and averted gaze, appeases the victim and inclines us to make restitution for the misdeed. This too restores fairness. So A commits some misdeed and feels guilty about it and expresses submission, maybe verbally apologizing or otherwise indicating responsibility. And this tends to break off or suppress the anger of the victim. That circular symbol is supposed to be the blocking symbol in football diagrams. Similarly, gratitude for receiving a favor makes us feel indebted and inclines us to repay our benefactor. We have a strong sense of equity or fairness. In fact, all cultures instill the golden rule in their children. We may decline a favor that we will have difficulty repaying. We feel embarrassed when we are excessively praised. All these emotions mentioned so far are unpleasant to experience, but this does not mean they're bad for us or pathological. Negative feelings usually prompt us to take some adaptive action. Positive emotions just tell us to keep doing what we're doing. We can experience more than one emotion at a time, but we usually can only do one thing at a time, so we have to prioritize our needs. Is there any emotional incentive for performing good deeds? How do you feel when you do something praiseworthy? We feel pride when we perform a favor or achieve something of value. This success is signaled by erect, expansive posture and direct gaze, opposite expressions to those of guilt or shame. Pride entitles us to claim compensation, much as a dominant animal claims prerogatives of rank and displays dominance. Like many animals, we compete for social credit, which brings social and material dividends. If a society's values are constructive, society gains when people fulfill those values, such as competence in the arts and sciences. We admire these performers, applauding and rewarding them. When we fail to meet society's expectations, we experience guilt or shame and pay some penalty. Similarly, subordinate animals exhibit submission postures and yield resources to dominant individuals. The words people use when describing their emotions are notoriously vague. When I used to ask my students what they would feel if they were unsuccessful or had been mistreated or lost a loved one, they would say sad. I had trouble getting them to use more specific terms. We seem to have trouble identifying our emotions, let alone understanding how they work. And the poverty of words used to describe emotions seems to be a characteristic of all natural languages. The functions of some other emotions are more obvious. Each affect prompts us to take a particular action. Hunger causes us to eat. Thirst causes us to drink. Disgust keeps us from ingesting toxic substances. Fear keeps us away from various dangers. Itching rids us of skin irritants. Pain protects us from injury. Heat and cold sensations prompt us to seek moderate temperatures and appropriate clothing. Drowsiness inclines us to sleep, which is restorative. Fatigue inclines us to rest. Our smell preferences guide our choices of foods and even of sex partners. For example, research shows that gay men like each other's smell more than they like straight men's smell. Close relatives dislike each other's odor, a likely mechanism for incest avoidance. Curiosity prompts us to investigate our environment. When we learn something new, we experience a pleasurable feeling of insight. When we are baffled, we feel confusion and try another strategy. When we fail to solve a problem, we are bored and quit. So emotions guide learning. They also provide reinforcement and punishment for our decisions and actions. They attract our attention and make things memorable. This is because we need to focus on matters relevant to survival and reproduction. If we know which emotional features go together, which elicitors trigger which affect and lead to which behavior and expressions, we may be able to predict someone's behavior. For example, if people show fear, we can try to identify the perceived danger. We can also expect some avoidance response and a stressful arousal of the body. But since emotional expressions can be concealed or faked, we can't be sure people feel what they express. For example, Trump's frequent rages may be ploys to intimidate opponents. Species-wide nonverbal expressions evolved to influence the receiver to the sender's benefit. The function is not necessarily to aid the receiver. Some signals are deceptive. Again, our evolved behavior serves to aid the individual. Psychology has conducted much research on people's ability to identify the universal emotional expressions. However, just how each expression affects the receiver and why is a somewhat neglected topic. There is much to learn about emotions beyond identifying them and their expressions. One emotion whose function is rather mysterious is humor appreciation or mirth. Some of us have suggested that many jokes provide examples of awkward behavior to be avoided. The butt of a joke or clown or fool does something ludicrous. We laugh in appreciation for this object lesson to encourage the humorist to offer more jokes. We feel indebted to the humorist for this service. But why do children laugh when tickled? Even young chimpanzees enjoy being tickled and even vocalize in a way that resembles human laughter. Being tickled allows the young animal to practice self-defense because laughter is evoked by an unexpected thrust at a vulnerable body part. Laughter signals a desire for further tickling. Even young rats vocalize when they are tickled on the neck and seek out such stimulation. Besides humor, other artistic forms that are universal are likely to be generally adaptive. We often admire and reward the artist. Evolutionary theorists have explained the arts in various ways. For example, some music may set a desired mood, such as a lullaby. A lullaby in one culture will calm infants from another culture. A war dance may coordinate and inspire the warriors. Paintings often depict attractive, beneficial, environmental or human features. Literature and drama often present personal conflicts and dilemmas that can edify the audience. Themes of love, competition, and war are common. We imagine ourselves in the place of the characters and can learn from the experience. Emotions can be experienced in our imagination so that we can anticipate how a given action would make us feel. We plan our actions in real life by anticipating their emotional consequences. Without emotional incentives, we would not be spurred to act. Our research group is now wondering about tears of joy, which are often evoked by observing someone performing a good deed or offering a moving work of art. For example, my granddaughter at age 6, when told she was getting a puppy, said she was crying because she was happy. People mostly cry when they suffer some distress, such as loss of a loved one. This may signal a need for help. Similarly, when we cry with joy, we may be indicating our appreciation of some extraordinary bounty and our receptiveness to further benefits. But there are other possibilities. Emotion theorists seldom recognize the specific emotion of amorousness. It's universal, and we found that it is qualitatively the same emotion in gays as in straight people. It promotes pair bonding, a rarity in mammals, unlike the sex drive itself. The pair bond, what we call marriage, keeps couples together to raise their biological children. Being raised by their biological parents is usually a benefit for children. Step-parents tend to favor their biological children over their stepchildren because of shared genes. Again, there are many exceptions, but the trend still holds. Also, because of shared genes, we tend to care for our other genetic relatives too. This is called kin altruism. And the closer the relationship, usually the more inclined we are to help. We also sometimes help non-relatives, so long as we get help in return. That way, both parties benefit. Our capacities for anger, guilt, pride, and gratitude ensure that most of these relationships are reciprocal and not exploitative. Love is less conditional, inclining us to help even when no reciprocity is likely. We feel empathy for those we love and often help those in need. Acting emotionally is thought to be a bad thing. We are told that we must regulate our emotions, be rational. What does this mean? When we say we are acting emotionally, we usually mean we are being impulsive rather than acting with foresight. When we are being rational, we think about the consequences before we act. But even when we are rational, we are weighing the emotional payoffs from alternative courses of action. We are experiencing emotions vicariously in our imagination. We only act in pursuit of greater satisfaction. Pure thought would not tell us what to do. Emotions drive all of our voluntary behaviors. In a sense, they are the essential elements of behavior. We are always experiencing emotions when awake, and even sometimes when we are dreaming. They guide our every action and promote our survival and reproduction. Acting impulsively is not always a bad thing. In an emergency, we need to act quickly. Behaving spontaneously may be an endearing sign of honesty and sincerity. There's some indications it makes people more likable. Well, I've given you a crash course in evolutionary psychology. I hope I've got you thinking that maybe emotions are irrational or counterproductive or optional. All humans have the same basic emotions, and most emotions are found in other mammals too. Our biological needs are much the same as those of other mammals, and we have similar brain areas to mediate the behaviors that fulfill those needs. We use our experience, language, and culture to fulfill our emotional needs more effectively. For example, we cook to extract more calories from our food and to kill bacteria. We evolved our capacities for language, learning, and culture in order to survive and reproduce more effectively, not to thwart or suppress those timeless needs. Evolutionists reject genetic determinism. They realize that experience can always influence any biological impulse. No human action is solely determined by genes. The environment and experience always play a role. This is the doctrine of interactionism to which everyone subscribes. There is always an environmental context that might alter the behavior. The more we know about genetic factors in behavior, the better we may be able to shape a behavior by altering environmental factors. So knowledge of these genetic effects can be empowering. For example, limiting dietary intake of phenylalanine reduces the neurological effects of the genetic disorder PKU, phenylketonuria. Because all normal adult humans have the same emotions, albeit with different thresholds, knowledge of the emotions and other universals may foster feelings of solidarity with other individuals and groups. Some opponents of evolution in the American South at the time of the Scopes trial objected to the notion that blacks and whites were related members of the same species. But we also need to know how culture and individual experience result in variations in emotional behavior. Many disciplines in science and the humanities help us to understand emotional experience. Evolutionary psychologists seek to describe and explain human behavior, not to pass judgment on any of it. However, knowledge of human nature, and especially the emotions, may guide us as citizens in proposing social policies that are realistic and effective in promoting everyone's happiness and well-being. Emotions change through development. The emotional life of infants is different from that of adolescents, for example. And the sexes have different thresholds for some emotions, such as greater fear in women because of their vulnerability imposed by pregnancy and childcare. When a sex difference is universal or hormonally based, it is hard to say that it's solely due to upbringing. For example, women everywhere surpass men in remembering the location of objects. Emotions can mislead us. Evolution favors better traits, but not perfect ones. However, emotional pathology has to be rare, just as most other diseases are rare because they reduce biological fitness and so are selected out against, they're weeded out. If we can understand the normal functioning of the emotions, we may be better able to identify malfunctioning and correct it. So trust your emotions. You really have no choice. Thanks very much for your attention. Questions or comments, anything?
Thank you all so much for coming. And this was indeed an important talk. I mean, while you're considering your questions, I was wondering if Professor Weisfeld could use his psychological analysis to explain the slap that was that rocked around the world. I mean, anger, frustration, shock, rationality seem all to be involved in that episode. So what would a psychologist like you say to explain that happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the anger was justified by this perceived maladroit comment. Mm-hmm. But I think many of the criticisms have taken the form of alternative ways of expressing that anger. Mm-hmm. And I think many of us would have preferred a verbal rejoinder, some retort that would have had the same effect of counteracting the misbehavior. It made me think of my time as a community organizer in Chicago, working with street gang kids. What they would do when they were offended was to strike back. Mm. And there were a lot of fights, physical fights. And I remember one of my colleagues said that in explaining an alternative way of dealing with such a situation, he said, you fight with your fists, we fight with our mouths. We argue and we keep it on a verbal plane. But other people may have other views of this.
Yes. I think there is a question in the chat already.
Oh.
Which type of mammals are prone to keep the same emotions throughout the evolution of time? This comes from Louis.
Keep their same emotions over time?
Yes, which types of mammals are prone to keep the same emotion throughout the evolution of time?
Well, I'd say a good indication of the behavior of an animal is its anatomy, because anatomy and behavior have to work together functionally. So if the animal's form hasn't changed much, probably its emotions haven't changed much. But an animal, say, that has gotten larger over time might become more aggressive because it'd be better able to subdue smaller opponents. But I don't know if that gets at your question. Yeah, it's a good question.
Suzette Bristol has raised her hands and her mic is unmuted, so she can ask her question.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. I'm not in my office. But I really enjoyed your talk. And I do have a couple of questions. They're kind of related to each other, and they're from the perspective of a teaching. So I'm wondering if you've ever thought about like how an instructor's emotional way of teaching ever has an impact on the students' learning, meaning the investment level of the instructor while teaching a course, if that plays a role in how students learn. And along with that, when students receive feedback from instructors, it elicits a specific emotional response of defensiveness. And I'm wondering if there is a way to maybe early in the semester work in some kind of approach to talking about this defensive emotional response to getting feedback from peers and instructors.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, those are good questions. Well, I'd say that to engage the students, it's good to show a lot of emotion, a lot of passion, because I think it indicates conviction about what one is saying. So, you know, a dispassionate statement might not be as compelling as one that's expressed with more animation. And, you know, I also would maybe mention that when I was teaching, I was able to register when the students were absorbing something and when they were paying attention. And I think a lot had to do with that dilation of their pupils, because when we're interested in something, our pupils tend to dilate. And I think we all subconsciously register those nonverbal cues in the students. And so, of course, when we're teaching online, we don't have the benefit of that nonverbal feedback. But as far as how to encourage students to feel less offended when their opinions are contradicted, of course, we usually try to caution students to be respectful toward each other and to not make negative comments about what they might say. But I don't know if that really addresses what you have in mind.
Yeah, it does. I've been focusing recently on how students receive feedback. It seems that they're so concerned, as they should, with passing the class instead of improving what they're doing. And I'm trying to figure out a way to lessen that defensive response from when they get feedback from other students, instead of just ignoring what people are trying to help them improve, maybe pull back a little bit. I'm trying to find a way to do a module, like an instructional module on getting feedback and how to incorporate it into how you do things. But yeah, thank you.
There's Bruce, did you
I have a question, yeah. I didn't know how to raise my big hand. So,
Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Glenn. My question is about the role of concepts in characterizing emotions. So let me give you a couple examples. So philosophers distinguish, everybody does, between remorse and regret. But the thought is the affect part won't do the trick, that they're not distinct or sufficiently distinct. So the thought is remorse essentially involves a belief, namely a belief that you've done something wrong, whereas regret doesn't. And so you need to introduce this concept that it involves a belief that you've done something wrong. Or there might be other cases. I don't know, Sartre says there's a difference between fear and anxiety. He gives an example if you're walking along a path that's kind of high up and you might fall off the cliff if you slipped on the pebbles on the path. He says you'd be afraid, but if you have the same feeling, but because you think, gosh, I might just throw myself off the cliff, he calls that dread or anxiety. So anyway, he's trying to characterize, and the people who distinguish between remorse and regret, by saying you can't distinguish them merely by the affect or even the dispositions to behave. You have to introduce the concept, namely, let's do remorse, the concept that you have a belief that what you've done is wrong. Is your view that some emotions don't require this kind of conceptual aspect, or that none of them do? Or I don't know exactly. That's my question about what you think about concepts needed to distinguish some emotions or not.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's a good illustration of how difficult it is to rely on semantics to distinguish among the emotions. There are all these ambiguities in the way people use these terms, even within the same culture, let alone across cultures. So for example, with your example of regret, yeah, maybe there isn't an element of responsibility in the way we English speakers use the term, but the French would say regret, to regret is to feel responsibility as well as to are being sorry that the event occurred. So there are all these difficulties in using words to try to distinguish among the emotions. And I think we have to rely on other sources of information, such as the behavior, including the behavior of animals. And one way of reasoning about what the basic emotions are is to kind of use reverse engineering and think what behavior would be necessary because this adaptive need must be met.
Yeah,
So,
I think the words are one thing, but I'm just making a conceptual distinction that I think there is whatever words you use, there is this distinction between regret and remorse. And, I always say to my students, look, the only sentence I know in Spanish is el libro es rojo, the book is red, and I can say it in English or Spanish, but anyway, there's a proposition or concepts being expressed by either the Spanish word or the English sentence, and they might be different. I mean, the word in French might be different than, it means something different, but kind of close to what we mean by regret. But I'm just saying, okay, wait a minute, there are these conceptual distinctions between remorse and regret that I'm pointing out, and the only way I can mark them is by making a reference to some difference in belief, because the affect and the behavioral disposition isn't going to be sufficient to distinguish those concepts, words aside.
yeah, well, you mentioned this example of the distinction between fear and anxiety. And I think many psychologists would say that a distinction has to do with whether the source of to be avoided is recognized or not. If it's vague, if it's inchoate, maybe we refer to that as anxiety. If it's something concrete, like falling off a cliff, then we would refer to it as fear. And I also want to say something that your remarks suggested to me with respect to the development of emotions. Children have to be able to understand what a social norm is in order to perceive that it's been violated in the case of anger. So young infants, when they are restrained, when their limbs are held down, they show anger. They show the nonverbal expression of anger. But then when they're older, they only express anger when someone has deliberately mistreated them. But they have to understand about intention and the norms prevailing in society and so forth in order to recognize that misdeed having occurred. But the affect has been the same all along. So as children get older and more cognitively sophisticated, they can better identify the essential elicitor that is appropriate for experiencing a given emotion.
I have things to say about anger, Glenn. I think you and I disagree about its function, but here's a case where a fool, me, might rush in where he just shouldn't. But I want to let other people, if they have questions, you know, ask them. I'll come back if, you know, it's not true.
Yeah, please.
There's a question from John Gruder in chat. The question is, cultures encourage some emotions and discourage others. Is this evolutionary pressure, or are cultures adapting biology, and how do the two interact?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think a lot of these cultural differences are differences in the tendency to express an emotion publicly. And there's a lot of evidence say that the Japanese are more likely to suppress expression of their emotions than Westerners are. But they may still feel the emotion. We did some research on Chinese adolescents, and we found that even though they tended not to display dominance or pride when they were successful, they still felt great pride in their accomplishments. But all the emotions have to be experienced pretty much the same across cultures because they all have the same biological needs that have to be addressed.
Any other questions or comments for Glenn? This has been a very interesting talk. And
Walter?
yes. Oh, yes, Gary, yes.
Glenn, relative to your last point about expression of emotion, if you recall, some of the seminal work on emotions was done by Pavlov, and he had his animals strapped down, and yet he was still able to condition emotions. So I think that supports what you said, that the expression of an emotion is very different than the existence of the emotion.
Yeah, there's a school of thought that says that in order to experience these emotions, these affects, you have to get feedback from your body as to the physiological changes that are occurring, like increased heart rate and fear, or you have to be able to feel the emotional expressions as reflected in your facial musculature. But if you suppress those sources of feedback in animals or people, you still get indications that the affect is inexperienced. So in the cases of dogs, they've spinally transected them so they can't get any feedback from the lower body about these physiological changes, but they still seem to show fear of danger and anticipation of food and so forth.
And the fear of negative feelings. I was thinking what Suzette was asking about with the students. The thing about getting negative feedback from your peers is that the trouble is that only negative feedback has implications for system change or organism change. Mm-hmm. Positive feedback has no such implications.
Yeah.
And so it may be, Suzette, that the students are just going to have to, take it.
Is that true? Somebody violates a norm and people say, hey, that was great. Keep that up, that rebellious behavior. That is an incentive to change the norms. Some great person sees that, this kind of anti-gay sentiment is unjustified and speaks up against it. And people say, hey, yeah, great, go. That's an incentive to change norms. It's positive incentive.
Yeah, there's some people who think we don't encourage our children enough, that they may do the right thing, but not really be sure that it's the right thing.
If people if you get positively rewarded for what you're doing, you're more likely to do it again.
Right?
You're denying that.
And positive feedback is just essentially saying steady as she goes.
No, it means that it may be steady as she goes and all, but the person's a steady as she goes and a rebel is an incentive to change social norms for the rebels. Yay. That's the point. Keep doing what you're doing, being rebellious, i.e. challenging the social norms.
I really, I see what you're saying, but in this case, when I don't think I'm talking about social norms. I'm just talking about the current behavior of the system or of the individual.
I thought you said initially it's not an incentive to change things. Maybe you meant the individual change, but it's an incentive to change the social norms, which I think is important to Glenn when it comes to anger is essentially connected to social norms, according to what Glenn says. Maybe we're talking past each other. I thought you were talking about no incentive to change things. That's what you started with. I thought that meant no incentive to change the social norms. And I'm making a case, it could be plenty of incentives if you're praising the rebel where the social norms need changing.
Most of our communications, I would say, interpersonal communications are negative. I mean, most of what we say to each other is how to be more like me. And telling other people you're not enough like me. And you should think this, and you should do this, or you shouldn't be like this.
Yeah.
And that's how society gets glued together with us, in the norm sending process, would you say?
I don't know your point. It seems to be a different point now. It seems to be a different point about, what motivates people to say and do things is kind of deviated from your initial claim about incentives to change. So I don't think it's right. I mean, I think when I teach philosophy, I just teach people how to think, and I tell them what I think. And I tell them, look, you're mistaken. This is wrong behavior. I don't care what you think. I don't care you shouldn't care what I think. You should just say, hey, do I have any reason to be anti-Semitic or anti-gay? Do I have any reason except I read the damn Bible or something like that? That's BS. Just think for yourself.
I see what you're saying. No, you're right. I wasn't thinking in terms of incentives, though. I was just saying in the general case, there is nothing in a positive communication that even gives us clues as to how others or that other who's speaking to us thinks we ought to be different.
I don't know what that means. Exactly.
And then there may not be an incentive and there may not be any change. I'm just saying that negative feedback has the information for desired change on the part of the communicator or the source of the negative feedback, while positive feedback has no such implications. It doesn't have the information in it. It just says you're doing fine. Whatever it is you're doing, keep doing it.
How about this? You've been beating your dog. I say, stop beating it. That's bad. You're a bad person. Okay, that's negative feedback. Someday you don't beat your dog. You pet your dog, you give him food and water. I say, hey, nice going. How about that? Equally, they both provide incentives for you to change your bad behavior. And when someday you behave well towards your dog, I give you an incentive by praising you to change your behavior from what your normally bad behavior is to now treat your dog well. Either one works. Positive or negative behavior will change. It can, in principle, change the norms of society, and your bad behavior towards your dog, I can change depending on what the situation is.
Well, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this wonderful? That's the idea of a philosopher and a psychologist sort of arguing about emotions. This is what they the brown bag series can do. And if Jacqueline's voice was available, she'll be telling you now that this talk has been recorded and will be put up on our center's website, which is linked to YouTube, so that if you have other thoughts and you'd like to listen to the conversation again, you could always tune in and have that. And of course, you can use the talk in your class. If there's a specific point that is relevant to what you're teaching and you want an illustration, you can just take this talk and use it in your teaching. So it was a very important conversation. And I am now going to look at this slap through psychological lens. I mean, if a verbal slight has been issued, maybe the best retort is another verbal slight. Like in African American culture, there is something called playing the dozens. If young people who are friends decide that they are going to do that, then you can have insults about your mama, and then somebody else gives you an insult about your mama. However, if you were to opt out of it and say, look, I'm finished with the dozens, and somebody were to say something against your mama, then it requires a physical retort. That's when you fight. You see. So as Suzette points out, that's the same with the rap culture, sort of rap battles. So that's very informative. So Glenn, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I think what you said about this doing the dozens is very apropos. But we were working mostly with White Street Gang kids, so they didn't have that culture. They mostly just duked it out.
Score one for the African American culture.
Right.
So thank you so much, Ben, for this talk. And if Jackie were able, she would be showing you two little gifts that we would normally give to that we will give to you as a token of our appreciation. One is a mask, which you don't need anymore, but you can keep it as a souvenir for this time. It has the Humanity Center logo on it, and a journal that has the Humanity Center logo on it. So thank you all for coming. And
thank you.
All right. Having said that, and no final words from Glenn, I will end the recording.